For nearly 50 years, Ukraine was the second most powerful republic in the largest empire on Earth. At its height, the Soviet Union spanned 11 time zones and governed over 290 million people. It was, by land area, the largest country to have ever existed in recorded history. And then, almost overnight, that empire simply vanished. This is the story of how that happened and Ukraine's central role in it. Let's begin in 1945, as the guns finally fell silent across a shattered continent. But to understand how, we have to start at the end of the last war, amid the rubble of a devastated nation. Millions of homes, factories, and farms had been destroyed. Rebuilding Ukraine would take a Herculean effort. The Soviet government poured massive resources into rebuilding Ukraine's cities and infrastructure as quickly as possible. Ordinary citizens, including many women and elderly workers, played a crucial role in this massive rebuilding effort. Within a decade, Ukraine had not just recovered, it had become one of the industrial powerhouses of the entire Soviet Union. Ukrainian factories produced everything from steel and tractors to rockets and aircraft. Ukraine's aerospace industry, based in cities like Dnipro, even contributed directly to the Soviet space program. In 1954, an unusual administrative decision was made, one that would echo for generations to come. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev transferred the Crimean Peninsula from Russian administration to Ukrainian administration. At the time, this was largely symbolic. Both republics were part of the same Soviet Union anyway. Officially, the transfer was framed as a gesture marking the 300th anniversary of a historic alliance between Russia and Ukraine. But decades later, after the Soviet Union dissolved, this decision would become the center of a major international dispute. We'll explore exactly how that dispute unfolded in a later episode of this series. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Ukraine's cities grew rapidly, fueled by coal, steel, and heavy machinery production. New apartment blocks, schools, and hospitals were built at record pace to house the growing urban population. The Donbas region alone became one of the most important coal mining and manufacturing centers in the entire USSR. Kyiv itself grew into a major center for science, technology, and higher education during this period. This period of growth is still remembered by many older Ukrainians with a complicated mix of pride and nostalgia. Millions of ordinary Ukrainians enjoyed rising living standards, free education, and guaranteed employment under this system. Healthcare and education were provided free of charge, a point of pride within Soviet propaganda of the era. But this system also came with strict limits on free expression, political dissent, and independent thought. Public criticism of the government, or even of specific Soviet policies, could result in serious legal consequences. In the 1960s, a generation of young writers and intellectuals, later called the Sixtiers, began quietly pushing back. Figures like poet Vasyl Simonenko and literary critic Ivan Zhuba became influential voices within this movement. Their small circle of readers and supporters became known simply as the Sixtiers generation, a name still used by historians today. Their writings often celebrated Ukrainian folklore, landscapes, and everyday life, framed in ways authorities found subtly subversive. They wrote poetry and essays exploring Ukrainian identity, history, and language, topics considered politically sensitive. Simply writing in the Ukrainian language, rather than Russian, was itself sometimes viewed with suspicion by authorities. Their work circulated secretly, hand-copied and passed from reader to reader in a network known as samizdat. The word samizdat literally meant self-published, a quiet act of defiance against state control of information. Soviet authorities responded harshly, arresting many of these writers and sending them to labor camps or internal exile. Some dissidents spent years, even decades, separated from their families as a result of this crackdown. Some dissidents, like human rights activist Vyacheslav Chernobyl, would later go on to play major roles in Ukraine's independence movement. Despite the risks, this quiet cultural resistance kept a distinct sense of Ukrainian identity alive through the Soviet decades. Many of these once banned writers are now celebrated as national heroes in independent Ukraine today. By the 1980s, Ukraine was a modern, industrialized society. But beneath the surface, one particular industry held enormous risk. Nuclear power had become a proud symbol of Soviet technological achievement, providing electricity across the region. The Chernobyl plant alone supplied roughly 10% of Ukraine's total electricity needs at the time. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, that pride turned to catastrophe at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. A safety test went catastrophically wrong, causing an explosion and fire that released radioactive material into the atmosphere. Firefighters and plant workers responded immediately, working to contain the disaster, often without full knowledge of the danger they faced. Their courage during the crisis is now honored annually, and a memorial stands dedicated to their sacrifice. Nearby residents were not immediately informed of the danger, and evacuation only began more than a day later. The nearby city of Pripyat, built specifically to house plant workers and their families, was evacuated within 36 hours. Residents were told at the time that the evacuation was temporary. Most were never able to return home permanently. Eventually, more than 350,000 people were evacuated, and a large exclusion zone was established around the plant. This zone, roughly 30 kilometers in radius, remains one of the most heavily monitored areas on Earth today. The long-term health and environmental effects of the disaster are still studied and debated by scientists today. A protective structure, completed decades later, now safely contains the damaged reactor for the long term. Today, the exclusion zone remains largely uninhabited, with nature slowly reclaiming the abandoned streets and buildings. Ironically, the absence of human activity has allowed local wildlife populations to thrive in ways rarely seen elsewhere. Beyond its human and environmental toll, Chernobyl had another, unexpected consequence. It badly damaged public trust in the Soviet system itself. Many Ukrainians, and Soviet citizens more broadly, felt betrayed by the government's slow and dishonest initial response. The government's slow, secretive initial response stood in stark contrast to a new policy Gorbachev was just beginning to champion: glasnost, or openness. Under glasnost and its companion policy, perestroika, or restructuring, censorship loosened and public criticism became possible. For the first time in decades, newspapers began openly discussing topics once considered forbidden, including the true scale of the Chernobyl disaster. In this new, more open atmosphere, a Ukrainian pro-independence movement called Rukh emerged in 1989. Rukh brought together writers, workers, and former dissidents, all demanding greater autonomy for Ukraine within and eventually beyond the Soviet system. Rukh's rallies grew rapidly, from a few thousand participants to hundreds of thousands within just a couple of years. Blue and yellow, the colors of Ukraine's historic flag, reappeared publicly for the first time in decades. Similar independence movements were gaining momentum across the Soviet Union, especially in the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. In 1990, more than 300,000 Ukrainians formed a human chain stretching over 400 kilometers, echoing a similar Baltic protest. Throughout 1990 and 1991, the Soviet Union's economy weakened, and central authority in Moscow grew increasingly fragile. Food shortages, inflation, and political uncertainty spread across the entire Soviet Union during this turbulent period. In August 1991, a failed coup attempt against Gorbachev in Moscow accelerated the empire's collapse even further. The coup's failure badly weakened the Communist Party's authority and emboldened independence movements across every republic. Ordinary citizens across Ukraine watched these dramatic events unfold on television, sensing that history was being made in real time. Just days later, on August 24, 1991, the Ukrainian parliament took a historic vote. With an overwhelming, near unanimous majority, Ukraine's parliament voted in favor of independence. With overwhelming support, Ukraine's parliament declared independence from the Soviet Union. This declaration stated clearly that Ukraine's territory was indivisible and inviolable, a phrase that carries deep significance even now. News of the declaration spread quickly across the country, met with a mixture of celebration and cautious uncertainty. But independence still needed the direct approval of the Ukrainian people themselves. Voter turnout was remarkably high, with citizens from every region of the country participating. On December 1st, 1991, in a nationwide referendum, more than 90% of voters chose independence. Remarkably, even in regions like Crimea and Donbass, a majority of voters supported independence, a fact often overlooked in later disputes. This historical fact would later become an important point of reference in discussions about the region's political status. Just weeks later, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, and 15 new independent nations emerged from its ruins. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time. For the first time since Kievan Rus, Ukraine stood as a fully independent, internationally recognized nation. Ukraine was free, but freedom, as the next chapter of its story would show, comes with its own difficult questions. But independence would come with its own enormous challenges: economic collapse, political instability, and an uncertain relationship with Russia. If you've enjoyed this journey through Ukraine's history so far, please subscribe. The story is about to enter its most intense chapter yet. What do you think independence meant to Ukrainians in that moment? Share your thoughts in the comments below.